Dr. Dion Henry, greetings, 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 my friend, and Happy New Year and happy season 8 of the
See,
PRT.
that's right. Season 8. Happy New Year to you, Pastor Paul, and to our viewers. Praise God for a new season, new year. With the new year, we have new opportunities, new challenges, but we're
Mercy.
going to meet it with new faith so that we can be overcomers. So again, happy New Year.
Oh, wow, man. It feels like it's been a long time since we've been in this space, my brother.
Yeah.
December,
Wow.
I think, what was it, November?
Well, no. I think it was the first weekend of December or the second week. First weekend of December, yes. And we did a show on hymns. And we featured.
Oh, that's right.
Yes, we went right to the First Church in Huntsville, Alabama.
Right.
And we were able to show a little bit what's happening with the hymns. And so I think that was the first weekend of December.
Right. Festival of Hymns. That was that Pelk weekend. Wonderful, wonderful experience there, watching and kind of looking in that window, peeking in that window at Pelk this year. Listen, we want to welcome our audience back, our viewers this evening. Thank you again so much for joining us. We know, listen, we have missed you. We have missed you guys. We're normally in this space on Friday nights now, and we kind of get used to coming on and seeing your comments and seeing your chat. And we want you to know how much we really appreciate each and every one of you that come and add to these conversations. I know we don't always, haven't always been able to get to everybody's comment or everybody's question, but you know, how you enrich this platform just means so much to us. And we often, when we come back, Dr. Henry, when we come in our little meetings, sometimes we'll talk about the chat that we see that you guys are having with each other. And just what a great experience that is. Listen, I'm excited about season 8, man. Season 8 is upon us.
Yes.
This is going to be a, how many, 13-part season, if I remember
13?
correctly.
Something like that.
3 months, 3 quarters,
like
or 1 quarter rather. And so
listen,
we want to, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, Pastor Paul,
We're missing somebody.
but guess what? We're missing someone. And that is Pastor Roger Wade.
Pastor Roger Wade. That's right.
Yes.
Listen,
so
he has not left us. He is still
right.
with us.
He's still with us. He's still with us.
He's going to be with us in season 8, and we're excited
right.
about that.
That's right. That's right. Just had some things he had to do and so forth, but he is with us. And also, I know our viewers, you have noticed, but this is a new time. I'm looking at the chat. I never know we're on. Oh, we got to fix that, Pastor Paul. So, yeah, look, we got something in the chat. So here's the thing. We are on
chat. Where's it
8 p.m. right there in our comment section there.
There
we got Rodney's comment. And yes, we are at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So we switched the time. This time seems like it would be work better, and so at 8 p.m. we are on Friday night. Please, we got to get that word out, Pastor Paul. Got to get it out.
Yes, indeed, Rodney. We are not hiding from you, my friend. We are. Right. Hey, listen, and Rodney, we got a chance to see a picture. Pastor Wade took a shot with you, a picture with you.
And I did too.
Pelk this year. Oh, that's right. Yeah. And then put it in our chat, and we all got to, hey, and it is just so awesome to be able to put faces with some of the names that we see in the chat. Again, we appreciate each and every one of you so much. I see Andrew Brown saying, welcome back. You were missed. All right, Andy, good to see you in the chat as well up there in Berrien Springs, Michigan. All right, listen, let's talk very quickly, and then let's get to our guests about what's happening in the month of January, Dr. Dion. I'm sorry, Dr. Henry. I'm talking like I'm a member of your church.
Well, listen, we know, we're going to talk about tonight a little bit, but next week, there is a shortage. That's right. There is a shortage right now from what we've been hearing within our denomination, but we're going to unpack that a little bit, but a shortage of pastors and teachers. And, again, we're going to unpack that. What does that mean when we say shortage? Does it mean that there's not a lot of applicants? Does it mean that there's not a lot of people going into this field? Does it mean, so we'll unpack that next week. So you want to be here so that you can hear the conversation that's going on within our division.
Listen, Dr. Henry, I know, sometimes on the basketball court when people are talking trash and somebody will go in and make a shot on somebody and my screen is not wide enough, but they'll do this and go way down. It says too small, too short. It's like, it feels like in some of our schools and some of our churches, it's like we're too small. We don't have enough. To be able to compete with some of the other schools and some of the other things. And so we got to talk about that. The following week, third week in January, third Friday night, we're going to be looking at event planning. Many times people look at event planning as these big events like a general conference session or a youth congress. Those are big events, and it takes a lot to put in, a lot of effort and a lot of energy to put in, a lot of planning. Some of these things are planned years in advance, and these big events. I think what we often fail to realize is that Sabbath school is an event. Worship service is an event.
You went there.
Community service feeding program is an event.
Yes.
And we are not often intentional about training our people, teaching our people to plan effective events. And so we said we want to be, relevant, resourced, and real. So we're going to do a session and we're going to bring in some event planners and talk about how to help us do better at planning and executing our events at the local church level, not just in these big wide events. Camp meeting is an event, but how we do it at the local church level as well.
And this is an opportunity for all of the officers, leaders of your church. You want to make sure they get on and be on this program because, as Pastor Paul was mentioning, man, listen, the church is a big event planning organization, right? Yeah. And when we do it well, then we could be more effective. So that's the event planning. Hey, listen, we're going to end up the month, Pastor Paul, with Carlene Sinclair. All right, happy Sabbath from Claremont, Florida. We like that.
Yes, indeed.
So listen, we are going to end our January time talking about the 2025 project. The 2025 project. Now, you definitely want to come out for this. We're going to give you a lot of history behind this. We're going to talk a little bit about the Heritage Foundation because the development of the plan is kind of led by them. We're going to talk about the history of this push and this movement all the way from Nixon to a center stage in Reagan's time. And then we're going to talk about the initiatives that they have planned here in 2025 by a conservative group. So there's a lot that we're going to talk about and how this can impact or will impact us. And so this is one that you want to bring in. Make sure your religious liberty person comes on here. This is the one that you want to bring in, your leadership team so that they can understand what's happening within our.
Yeah, this is kind of the one of the first delves that we've done into this kind of stuff. And so I'm very interested to get into that topic, particularly that I know on the 15th of this month is the first primary. It's at least a Republican primary. But I think some of the things that are going to come out in this conversation may affect some people and how they understand this political season right now. So we'll see. But you don't want to miss that. We got a great January. Matter of fact, we got February lined up. Can I throw it February at him right quick, Dion? I'm not going to give him all the detail. Listen.
Give it 30 seconds, Pastor Paul, because I'm excited about what's about to happen tonight.
Okay. But let me just, so February is Black History Month. And I was just really intrigued by what we came up with. The first installment of this. This is Black History and the White Church, y'all. Woo! Black history and the white church. We read an article not too long ago out of Spectrum magazine that dealt with some of this stuff, and we're going to be looking at that first weekend in February, and then we got a great February lined up for you. We're bringing a slave food back. We're looking at urban evangelism. We're looking at the Office of Regional Conference Management. Those are some things we're going to be addressing in the month of February. You don't want to miss February. Can we do March? I'm not going to do March. All right, let's go, because our guest is waiting. I'm looking at him on the side in the green room here, and he's anxious and he's ready to go. Dr. Henry, talk to us, man. What do we got? What's on the table tonight? We talked about the others for the rest of the month. What's happening tonight?
We are going to deal with this conflict in Israel. We know a lot of people are talking about it now throughout Christendom, and so we're going to look at this from possibly another perspective. And we have somebody on here that is going to really challenge our thinking. He always does. He's a familiar guest on the PRT. Pastor Paul, who do we have at the table?
We have, oh man, I wish I remember how to pronounce his name as he put it on his Facebook profile. He'll tell us what that is, but we know him as Dr. Keith Augustus Burton, the one and the only. We are excited and delighted to have you with us tonight, Doc. Thank you again for taking the time to hang out with us here at the table. Our greetings on behalf of our colleague as well, who's not with us, Pastor Roger Wade, but thank you again for joining us tonight, Doc.
Shabbat Shalom. It's good to be here. And my other name, the name I'm embracing now, is actually, the long form is Kaita Chukwu. Kaita Chukwu Yao Magana, and I still got Burton. And basically, I'm not going for a formal name change, but as I dig deeper into my roots with the DNA and everything, and I found out I'm mostly Igbo. And so I saw the first name that sounded like Keith, and Kaito was there. So Kaito Chukwu means may God be praised. And Yao is my Ghanaian day name. I was born on a Thursday, so I'm Yao. And Magana was the name that was actually given to me by the chief of the Dagomba people in North Ghana. And so they had a whole ceremony for me, and they gave me that name about 10 years ago. And I haven't really used it, but apparently it's also a title. So when I go back to that area near the Volta region, I'm supposed to go back to the village, and anyone who has any cases, I sit, sort of small claims thing, I'm supposed to sit and settle, whatever dispute they may have. Yeah. And so I am using those names now. And actually, one of the reasons why I changed on Facebook too, my students were finding me too easily. and so I want to be able to say what I want to say,
Incognito.
I love it.
That's awesome. Well, that's a great story.
Doc, so good to have you on the program. We usually give the person about Pastor Paul, 28 seconds, 29.5 seconds. But we know Pastor, we know Dr. Burton. I don't know. We want to give him 29.5 seconds.
Yeah, listen, there are some folks, Doc, that this might be their first encounter with you here on this edition of the Roundtable. So if you just give us a brief overview of where you are, what you're doing right now, give us some context, and then we're going to have a word of prayer, and then we're going to jump into our questions for tonight.
Okay, currently in the 29.5 seconds now, 19 seconds I got left. I currently direct the Master of Science and Spiritual Care program at Advent Health University. Formerly, I was at Oakwood University for many, many years, the founding director for the Center for Adventist Muslim Relations. Have served on a couple of general conference committees. I wrote a Sabbath School Quarterly and other things. And so those are some of my Adventist bona fides.
Okay, and we know that there are those even beyond the Adventism world, contributing. Our author, if I remember writer to the Huffington Post. So you're familiar with that as well. And again, we are just privileged and honored to have you join us here at the table tonight. Dr. Henry, would you offer a word of prayer for us and then take us in, man?
Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity, God, to talk about these subjects. And we ask, God, that you guide us and direct us. We thank you for Dr. Burton, Lord, and the knowledge that he brings to the table. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Well,
Amen.
well, Doc, again, thank you so much for coming on. We want to jump right into it. So, listen, regarding this war that's going on in Israel, this conflict with Hamas, tell me a little bit. Give us an overview, right? Give us an overview of the current state of affairs and what's happening on that side of the world.
Wow. There is a recent story, but then there is a whole story. And the recent story is on October 7th, Hamas crossed the border, came into Israel on three fronts, land, sea, and air. And as a result of that attack, about 1,200 people were killed, took about 300 as hostages. But even as people scratch their head wondering why would Hamas do this, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary of the General Secretary General of the United Nations, said, what they did was wrong, but we need to remember this does not happen in a vacuum. And so when we look at what happened with Hamas, it's a deep, deep, deep story. And I know we're going to get into some of those chapters during our conversation, but this is an outgrowth of, some may say, 1948, some may go to 1967, some may go to the 1973. These are all major confrontations between first of all, the Jews and Palestinians, and later after 48, Israel. And I don't want to say Palestinians, because if we look before 1948, anyone who lived in that region was a Palestinian, whether they be Christian, Muslim, or Jew. They were Palestinian, and so we have an ongoing conflict. And part of the catalyst for the latest a battle in this conflict that we see going on right now, or we may say war, but it's a prolonged war, and so at what point do you say that it's a war? So these are just ongoing battles, because the war has been going on for some time. And we know that some years ago, the Camp David Accord, uh, Jimmy Carter was the one who brokered peace between Egypt and Israel. And most recently, and that's what most recently, this year, there were talks between Saudi Arabia and Israel again about brokering some sort of peace agreement. And Saudi Arabia, yes, they did want some assurances for the Palestinians, but they were going ahead. And some people believe that the reason why, because many people say, why now? Some people believe that the reason why is because Hamas didn't want this conversation to continue, because it's going to further lessen their bid to regain lands that had been taken from them. And in fact, we see in the 80s, Hamas was even willing to say, okay, they would recognize certain borders as long as they go back to the borders of 1967. And so if we look at what's taking place with the Palestinians, we know that Hamas is one of two Palestinian governments. So we have Hamas and we have Fatah. Fatah is the one that is more friendly towards Israel, because Fatah, for the longest, has said, okay, we don't like what happened. And we may get into some of the details today, because really what happened, particularly after 1967, there was a mass occupation and ejection of Palestinians from their homes. And to this day, there are millions of Palestinians, descendant Palestinians, who are living in exile as refugees in Lebanon and other areas, whose homes were taken away from them. And so what we've basically seen over the years is a fight for liberation, basically. And even though I do not agree with what Hamas did, the way in which they did, I think war is horrible, but I understand what Antonio Guterres said, even though Israel didn't like it. But he was telling the truth when he said this did not happen in a vacuum. These are a people who, especially after we see the division in the Palestinian government, Hamas being designated by the US and others as a terrorist organization. And on a yearly basis, thousands of Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, also in the West Bank, but particularly in Gaza, being killed by the Israeli Defense Force. What we see here is an example of what Martin Luther King referred to as the language of frustration. The language of
Mm.
frustration. There are times when people feel they have no option when they resort to violence. And I know there are some people who are looking at this as if it's some age old conflict, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's actually less complicated than that, at least how I see it. It's a lot less complicated, even though there are some complex factors to what has taken place. Hopefully that's been comprehensive enough, and we could dig into some more things as we continue the discussion.
Sure. Yeah. Well, let's pick up there. I see a question in the chat from a Facebook user when it says, by the way, for those of you that are watching, when we put a comment up on the screen and your name shows up at as Facebook user, we know that you're probably watching from the group, and there are some permissions that you need to give to Facebook so that we actually know who you are. Otherwise, all we see is what you see on the screen there, Facebook user. But the question is, so is Palestine a place, a people group, or something else? Doc, can you respond to that very quickly before we go into the next one?
Wow. Yeah, and so that might seem like a simple question, but it's not actually. And so when I look at the situation itself, I use certain P's, and one is politics. I look at people, look at prophecy, and so when we look at Palestine, yes, it is a place. And when I say it is a place, it was a place that at one time was called Canaan. Okay, and of course, Canaan had a little section that was called Palestine, but we know that as Philistia. Okay, because that's Palestine is basically the Latin word for Philistia. And so the biblical Philistines, who, by the way, were originally from Egypt, from the island of Kaftor, and Kaftor is a son of Misraim. Okay, and so from a place perspective, yes, that's where it is. And we see that at various times in history, different regions have carried the name Philistia or Palestine. Of course, in the days of the Israelite monarchy, the United Kingdom of Israel, we see it was just a portion of the land of Canaan. By the time we get to the first century, Palestine is seen as that entire region, what we call the Levant, from Syria going to the border of Egypt. And then we see after the Jewish wars of 132 to 137, the Bar Kokhba revolt, when this was the final Jewish revolt in that area, and when the Romans conquered Simon Bar Kokhba or Bar Kokhba, he went with two names. They renamed that territory initially Syrio-Palestinia or Syria-Palestine, and then of course Palestine. And from that time, it's sort of been known as Palestine, even though there were some times, during the occupation by the Muslims, initial occupation by the Muslims, then later on to the Ottomans, that it went sort of by other names, but it's also referred to as Palestine. And most definitely after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, when it became a part of the British Mandate, it was British Palestine, the Palestinian Authority. And so that's why I mentioned before 1948, whoever you were living in that region, you were Palestinian, whether you were Jew, Muslim, Christian, atheist, Hindu, whoever you were, if you're born and raised there, you were Palestinian.
So I think the answer to the question, so is Palestine a place, a people group, or something else? The answer is yes.
Yes. Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
Or no.
It really is. Yeah. So it is. Okay. We could use the, I guess, the etymological concept of ethnicity. Okay, so when I say the etymological context, ethnos is the Greek word for people, but it's people who live in a certain geographical location. All right, and so all of us out here, I believe we're all American citizens. Even though I was not born here, I'm an American citizen, and so we are American. That is our ethnos. Okay. And so if your ancestry is Irish or Chinese or whatever it is, from a genealogical perspective, your ethnos is an American. And so when we look at, again, we're looking at the place Palestine. And so the ethnos of people who live there would be Palestinian, but it does not necessarily say anything about where their forebears or their first parents may have come from. But because they've been there generationally and somehow have some political ties to the land, then they are Palestinians.
Got it. So
So-
Doc, let's talk a little bit more about this history, the overtones. I think in the historical underpinnings, but let's see if we can do it from a place that may be more familiar with our audience, that our audience may be more familiar with. You mentioned the Philistines. I think our audience, they know the story of David and Goliath. And you mentioned that connection. Talk to us a little bit about that. Are the Palestinians today, is this the place where Goliath came from? Is this because you mentioned that age-old conflict. Is this that when the Israelites came into Canaan, into the promised land, are these descendants of the people that Israel was supposed to remove from the land or wipe out from the land? And is this a repercussion from the disobedience that we saw there? Give us a little bit of the background with the biblical reference in the historical context.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, actually. And I was at a church just two weeks ago, and I heard a pastor preaching when he made that connection, and he says, if when they attacked Jericho, etc., had they done what God said and wiped out Gaza, we wouldn't have the problem that we have today. That's what he says, and I screamed a little in the chair because whereas I understand the logic in that, the understanding is that these are the same people that have descended from Goliath and his 6 brothers, right? And so basically, when I look at it through the lens of continuity, this is when we get to the whole notion of people. All right. Now, first of all, when we look at the Philistines in Scripture, we do know that some Philistines were arch enemies of Israel, but then we also have some Philistines who were friends of Israel. In fact, David had a battalion in the Philistine army, etc. And so it's again, it's not as simple as it may seem when we look at generational. At generations, I should say, from that time to this. And so when we look at that region, first of all, Philistia was just a small section of the entire territory of Canaan. And it is obvious that when the Romans decided to name the entire region Palestine, they were basically saying, okay, we're going to name this mostly Jewish territory at that time after one of their arch enemies. And so it was sort of like an embarrassing thing, right? That they did there. And so, of course, so when you look at it,
sounds very colonial,
and you right. So when you look at it like that, and you see this region, which in the first century, of course, we know we had the provinces of Idumea, we had Judea, Samaria, and actually going up to Syrophoenicia, etc. And this all becomes Palestine. And so we see different peoples historically, sort of be melded into one. And so when we look at the people, so we know the place, but when we look at the people, we're seeing the people who are descended from a hodgepodge of different, if I could use ethnicity in the DNA sense. Okay, so not in the place sense, but in the sense of DNA. And so the people who we would call Palestinians before 1947 would be people, some of whom may be able to trace their ancestry back to Goliath or even Melchizedek. Right? Because that's that same region over there. And then there'll be people who could trace their ancestry back to David, back to Moses, back to Jehoshaphat, back to Jezebel, you know,
Wow.
back to Zipporah, back to a number of people, because this is where they lived. And so we see that, particularly in the first century with the Christ movement, that many of the people who lived there who had adhered to strict Judaism decided that they were now going to embrace the way. And they became followers of Jesus Christ. And then we see that at the time of the Islamic conquest, about 85% of that people in the region, according to some scholars, were Christian. The other 15% were Jews. And those who were Christian most of them had been Jews before they were Christian. Right. And so by about 900 or so, the majority of those people, and yes, we do have some people coming from different areas, coming from the Arabian Peninsula and different places, but the majority of people were there and they converted. All right. And so there were people who were members of Melchizedekan order who became Israelites. And some of these Israelites or Jews became Christians. And some of these Christians became Muslims. All right. And so when we look at it from a DNA perspective, there are people in this region who, because of politics, and we may say that it's religion, but it's mostly politics, because we know, folk don't just, I mean, it would be a great evangelist if they could just go into a place and preach a sermon and the whole nation decides that they're going to accept the message. Some people say Jonah did it, but anyway, it'd be a great evangelist. But the reason why many people embrace a religion in different places is because that now becomes a state religion. Because the state religion, this is who you all are now, and it's not because of any type of intellectual persuasion or any
Wow.
type of spiritual conviction. And so we have in this region people who, if we were to trace their DNA back to that region, they may be professing to be Jews. Some of them may be professing to be Muslim, Christian, or whoever, but just because they profess a certain faith, which is missionary, Christianity is a missionary faith, as is Judaism and Islam, doesn't mean that their DNA goes back to the same people, to that same place.
Got it.
And so,
I read somewhere, Doc. Actually, I read in several places that the descendants of Lot ended up being the Ammonites and the Moabites, and that the current residents of areas like Jordan come from the Ammonites, one of Lot's daughters. The others, the Moabites, more in the area of where Gaza is now. Any thoughts on those? I don't want to call them speculations, but on those ideas because then that puts a very close connection to Abraham and the Jews. If this is family, is this a family squabble? Is this?
But I think it's important to remember, because sometimes we can simplify things, but I think it's important to remember that even when we look at Lot and his daughters and the Ammonites and the Moabites, etc., their offspring, Ammon and Moab, married someone, and they married someone. So
gotcha.
they were the only people there. So it's not like Adam and Eve, or the three sons of Noah sort of thing. There are many, 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 many people there. And so in terms of these being the people that descended from, some of them may have a direct ancestry there, but it's a lot more complex, and so it's easy to keep it in simple terms. Oh yeah, they're all this, or they're all this, they're all Ishmael, and they're all this, and everything like that. But it really is not that simple. And even when we look at the people in that territory, when we look at Ishmael and Israel, for instance, not Ishmael and Isaac. Right?
Isaac.
And Isaac. Now, those are only two of the children. Right? There were many other sons, through Keturah, many other who settled in that region. And so I think sometimes, it's easy to simplify things. Oh, they're all from Ishmael, they're from this. But there were a number of other brothers who settled in that region, who populated that area. And even before they populated that area, when you see Esau, when he was old, what did they do? They got him a wife from Egypt. one of his cousins from Egypt to marry, etc. And so we have a very complex picture. And yes, I know it's easy to look at history through what I call patronyminal lenses. When we say, okay, this is our father and this is their father, this is their father, etc. But it usually is not as simple as that. Usually it's not as simple as that. And even though, yes, we do have these lineages. And then also, here's a reality when we look
Mhm.
again at lineage. When you look at a Joseph, for instance, and the offspring of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh, who was their mother? Well, she was Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, Egyptian priest of On. All right. And so we have these two becoming the progenitors of two Israelite tribes. Now, who they married and who their children married, we really don't know. Look at Judah and Tamar. Okay, Tamar was a Philistine or a Canaanite, etc. Right, and so again, it's not as easy. Oh, Ruth,
Yes. Yeah.
Ruth and Obed, and so it's really not as clean and easy because there were many people who lived in that region, and there was a lot of intermarriage. There were times, one of the problematic sections in scripture to me is when the folk came back from exile in Babylon, and Nehemiah's like, divorce all them foreign women, they've got these mass divorces and kicking people out, and he's pulling people's hair out because, and so to me that's kind of problematic, but it didn't last long. And even when we get to the resurgence of the Jewish Empire, and this is under the Hasmonean dynasty after the Maccabean revolt.
Mhm.
We find one of the first things that they did, particularly under John Hyrcanus, once he is able to get the victory over the Greeks and declare independence, he annexes Idumea and other areas, and he's saying, "Okay, you're part of us now," and they force them to become Jews. And so King Herod. In the Bible, we say Herod, king of the Jews. He was an Idumean, and he was an Edomite.
Mm.
He was an Edomite, but he was the king of the Jews, and his wife Herodias was Jewish. In the same thing. And so again, it's not as clean as we would sometimes
It's
like
complicated.
it
Yeah.
to be.
I love it.
Good. Good.
Well, Doc, I mean, listen, man, I feel like I'm in class. I'm soaking it all in, man. And so I guess what you're saying is not as simple as we try to make it to be, right? It's a little more complex, right? When you talk about
Absolutely.
this. So I want to ask this question. So let's talk about the bearing of this conflict as it relates to eschatology. Does this current conflict have anything to do with eschatology as we see it?
Yeah, I believe it does on many, many different levels. I think on the most basic level, you can look at Mark chapter 13 and Matthew chapter 24. In the
Okay.
last days, there should be wars and rumors of wars, okay? And so on the most basic level, that's what we have. Now, some people would like to tie it into Daniel chapter 11 and other areas. I honestly don't see that, and just because I see it doesn't mean that it's not, I don't see it, so it doesn't mean that that's not what it is. But I think there are people who, when they want to look at it through um, prophetic lens, do so with certain presuppositions. One presupposition is that the Israelis are direct, continuous descendants of the
Mm.
Israelites and the Jews, that
Mhm.
they've always been there. Now,
Yeah.
have there been Jews there over the years? Yes, there have. But we know that at the beginning of the 20th century, there were probably about 10% of the population, right? And so and again, they were Palestinians. They were Palestinian Jews. Okay, and so what we see with the ruling factor in Israel today, these are mostly what we call Ashkenazi Jews. And by the way, the Ashkenazi Jews DNA shows you that the Ashkenazi gene actually goes back to East Europe. Okay, it doesn't go back to that region. It's East Europe. All right. And this is called the mitochondrial DNA, going from mother to mother to mother. So it's not saying that some Jewish men may not have, spread to different places and married European women, but we do know that all Jews who are Ashkenazi, and I have Ashkenazi genes myself, all right, but that actually goes back to Europe. And so what we have, and again, helping to understand the current conflict, when we look at this reality, we see the creation of the state of Israel in 1948. And it's sort of a long time coming from the Zionist movement starting at the end of the 19th century with Theodor Herzl, and basically saying that the Jews needed their own homeland. I think I'm straying a little bit from your question here, but bear with me, please. And basically, this is because for many, 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 many years, Jews had been terribly treated in Europe. And so the homeland that was chosen was Israel, because this whole nostalgia of Israel being the homeland. But remember, from the standpoint of generations, those who had embraced Judaism over the generations cannot, even today, if you look at the DNA, they cannot trace their roots to that region. And so when we look at the current Israeli government, since the creation of the state of Israel in 1948, there has been, let me get my numbers right, I think there's been 14 prime ministers and 11 or 12 presidents, all right? The first few prime ministers and the first few presidents were all born, every single one of them were born in Eastern Europe. Every single one of them were born in Eastern Europe. Since then, to this day, all with the exception of one, their parents were born in Eastern Europe. And well, the current prime minister, Netanyahu, his father was born in Poland. His mother was born in Israel, but her parents are from Lithuania. The current president, his parents are from Ireland. And I think before Ireland, they were in the Ukraine, and his father was the high priest, not the high priest, the chief rabbi in Ireland, etc. And so we cannot move this out of the equation when we try to understand what's taking place in the region. And so we have basically folk, yes, who are being persecuted in Europe, who were given a country was sort of created for them, even though if you look at 1947, the United Nations resolution wasn't to create the state of Israel. It was basically to divide the land for Jews and, they said, Palestinians, which of course, they may have used the word Arabs actually, which would have been more correct. And the reason I say that is because most of the Jews were European, and so Arabs would have been those who were basically speaking Arabic, had been there for some time speaking Arabic, and so we have this reality that people from Europe are coming in and basically saying we have a right to be here. And those who have been there for generations are saying, well, what right do you have? Now, what's interesting, now, I don't profess Judaism, but let's say my mother decided that she was going to prove their DNA that her father's people were Jews and blah, 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 right? And so she gets a certificate saying that she is a genuine Jew, etc. Just by the fact that I'm born, I would be a Jew and I would have a right to Israeli citizenship. Okay, haven't lived there. So any person who claims Judaism around this world has the right of what you call aliyah, the right to go there. And there are many Americans who were born in this soil. Their parents were born here. Their grandparents, their great-grandparents were born in Europe and going back. And they have Israeli citizenship. And some of them will go over and do their years of service with the Israeli Defense Force.
Wow.
Even though they were never born there, their parents weren't born there, their grandparents, great-grandparents, nobody in their genealogy were actually born in that area that they can actually point to and say this person was born there. But they can go today and fight in the army, be given land. Some of them, many people, we hear about the settlements in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, etc., mostly in the West Bank. A lot of the settlers are coming from Europe and other places and are basically settling on Palestinian land. And the United Nations says nothing. America pretends to say something. But again, what happened on October 7th, 2023 did not happen in a vacuum.
We got some questions coming in the chat. Rodney wants to know about the Hebrew Israelites. If you could shed some light on that, I don't know, Doc.
Let's try if we can kind of keep it in the vein of
I know.
the conflict over
Right.
there. Is there any connection? Let's go
Right.
with that. Is there any
That's
connection? Yeah.
Now that's actually a good question. Good to hear from you, Rodney. Rodney, it's been years since I've seen Rodney's name or seen Rodney face to face, but it's great to hear from you, Rodney. Now, of course, what's interesting if you look at the Hebrew Israelite rhetoric on the streets, the word on the streets, okay, they're probably saying that the folk over there, this would probably happen because they're not the real ones. And you've heard the whole Kanye West thing, and Kyrie, them being Jewish in a sense, and so they use this sort of strange kind of reasoning to say that they're not really the genuine ones. Now, what's interesting as we look at the Hebrew Israelites, that there are different factors of Hebrew Israelitism and or Hebrew Israelism, because there are actually a group there right now living in a place called Dimona, and they came out of what's his name? It was a group that came out of Chicago. Then they went to Liberia, and they finally ended up living in Israel. And they believe that Black folk are the real Hebrews, and so they're there, and they were living in all peace, and they were basically just recognized by the Hebrew government about 15 years ago, I think it was, and now they have to fight in the IDF. They say, well, we recognize you now, and so you have to, your sons have to sign up, your sons and daughters, because both male and female have to do their national service. And so, again, I haven't heard anything current from any of the Hebrew Israelite camps, how they are interpreting this, but I suspect that they're probably looking at it as something that's coming to those who are there, because as far as they're concerned, those who are there are imposters. And I'm not saying that they are imposters, but of course that's the thinking of the Hebrew Israelites.
Okay, I'm thinking about we saw this thing go down in October. We have 1,200 Jewish folk and some internationals killed, slaughtered senselessly in this attack. And the last count I heard was upwards of 20,000 not Palestinians, but Gazians have been killed in the reprisals from the Israeli government. We've watched this thing unfold. We've seen the back and forth of, I think we felt, kind of unilaterally the disgust at what happened on that October day. I think that almost to the same and more degree, we have seen another level of just, repulsiveness of, these people, that is 20,000 people, weren't the people who came in to Israel and committed that atrocity. And we've seen these things spill over here at home in the United States. Most prolifically, I think we've seen it in college campuses, the protest. We just saw the dean, the president of Harvard step down because of some comments about anti-Semitism in front of a congressional panel. Is there a side? Is there a voice that the people of God, the Seventh-day Adventists, the church at large, Christianity, what should we be saying? What should we be doing? How do we conduct ourselves? Do we go out in march for what we feel is the atrocities now being committed against these innocent folk in Gaza? Some folk are saying, they're not innocent. They voted for Hamas and put them in charge, so they all deserve this. what do we do? I mean, or do we say, hey, you
Great
guys wouldn't
question.
be getting
Mm,
this if you hadn't
mm.
have done this? How do we, what's the correct biblical, godly way to position ourselves to address this very current and real issue?
Okay. Yeah. I would like to say though that it's not just the folk in Gaza who are being attacked right now by the Israeli Defense Forces. Also, people in the West Bank. Okay, so there've also
Talk.
been attacks, strikes in the West Bank, and of course now just this week we saw in Lebanon also, and so it's actually is spreading. But in terms of how we go about this, I think everyone has to decide for him or herself what he or she is going to do. But I think it's important for them to know why. And so when I look at this, I cannot look at it apart from what I'm hearing from people like Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president, and others in that region, and moving away from South Africa, coming closer to home. Jimmy Carter, who just lost his lovely wife, Rosalind, his book, Palestine Peace, Not Apartheid. Okay. Apartheid. Okay. Jimmy Carter recognizes that, most people recognize that that's what's taking place there. All right. And so you have, again, a mostly European regime coming in and saying, this land is our land, and it's happening in our lifetime. So it's not something that happened 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. This is something, there are people who are alive today when the United Nations made the resolution in 1947. By the way, a United Nations that was controlled by an America where segregation was legal. Okay, by an England that had colonized, by France that was colonizing, etc., etc. And so it was nothing for them to say, okay, let's have this solution where people are pushed out of their homes. It was nothing for them to say that, right? And so again, I think we need to think about these things when we think about what side we're going to take, or if we're going to take a side, or if we're going to approach, if we're going to do anything. And then also, I'm looking at uh, this through the lens again of lands being occupied. I was listening to Katie Turek some weeks ago, and she spoke about the need for the Israeli Defense Force to completely annihilate Hamas. And I thought about it and said, if we look at the history of the African National Congress, that started initially as a political movement, then after a while, when it became obvious that the apartheid government was not going to move towards making a more equitable South Africa, they had a violent wing. All right. And so many people in the ANC were being military trained for different quote unquote terrorist actions so that they can fight for their freedom. Right. And so we just liked the fuzzy side of Nelson Mandela, but he was in jail for terrorism. Okay, that's why he was in jail. The United States referred to the ANC as a terrorist organization. That was up to the time of Ronald Reagan. Okay, they were a terrorist organization. And so when we look at what's taken place, and again, I'm not condoning at all the horrible atrocities, but and going back to Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, this did not happen in a vacuum. And if we look at what's taken place since the various, we call the intifada, the various uprisings, particularly as we see the land that originally the United Nations said would go to the quote unquote Palestinians, okay, that land is getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. All right. And so what we're basically seeing is a resistance. And so, me personally, and I think this sort of would be like a Luke 4 position for me. Again, from a peace perspective, I don't want to see violence at all. But if I was to show where my compassion is more, my compassion is on the side of those who are being oppressed, because at the end of the day, it was uh, Desmond Tutu, Bishop Desmond Tutu, who, when folk were talking about remaining neutral when it came to apartheid in South Africa, he says, if an elephant was stepping on the tail of a mouse and you said you were neutral, the mouse would not appreciate your neutrality. And so I do believe that there is a side for people of God to take, but that should be the side of right, the side of justice, the side of justice. And wherever one sees justice, it is not just, I believe, for innocent children to be killed. We take that side of justice, but it's also not just for people to be displaced from their homes, etc. And so the thing about the kingdom message is that it's a message that cuts across. It's a message that cuts across. But ultimately, I believe it's a message that compels us not to necessarily listen to the propaganda machine, but to peel back the layers and say, okay, what's really happening here? And what's happening in that part of the world is that you had people, mostly from Europe, who basically says, we own this place, and they're pushing others back. And we should not be surprised when we see this violence. And I think what we need to be more engaged in is what people like Miko Peled, the author of The General's Son. His father was one of the Israeli generals from the very beginning. And he's basically saying, listen, what we have done to Palestine is wrong. And if anyone has read his book, you will see his wonderful narrative. It's, the subtitle is The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, or even Josh Nubner, when he looks at how Obama lost an opportunity to sort of broker lasting peace in that region. Again, these are Jewish authors. One of the more recent books that I've read is Shlomo Sen, the Invention of the Jewish People, where he's basically saying, listen, we know that most of us Ashkenazi are from Europe, etc. So we need to be a little bit more gracious in the way in which we treat people in a land that we kind of took over. And I think there's a way that we can move forward. And we as a people, I think, should be taking lessons from South Africa, from Rwanda, with truth and reconciliation, acknowledging the atrocities that have taken place, acknowledging how Israel came to existence in the first place, but basically saying, okay, this is where we are right now. How can we as people of peace help to broker some type of arrangement where swords will indeed be transformed into plowshares?
Wow. First of all, I just want to just thank you for giving us this overview of this conflict. You took us from Palestinians. What does that actually mean? And you took us through, you gave us a little Bible study too, right? Talking about the intermingling of different people from different places. And then even dealing with the prophecy question. The basics you dealt with, what the gospel says about rumors of wars and that sort of thing. And then led us to the stance where Christians should take, and that is the stance for alleviating suffering and being just, to those who are oppressed. Dr. Burton, man, I felt like I went through a class, Pastor Paul, like an intensive, man, a 2-week intensive.
We got some sociology, we got some geography, we got some history, we got some some etymology. We got a whole lot of ologies in this tonight, man. Good stuff.
Yes, we did.
Well, listen, I wanted to just before we go, Dr. Henry, I just kind of a follow up to that, and maybe our last question is like, whenever big things happen in the world, like when we saw 2020 rather, we saw George Floyd. We saw a lot of these issues on justice happening, or injustice, social injustice happening. A lot of us in the church, we were like, okay, where's the conference statement coming out on this issue?
Yeah.
Is the General Conference going to issue a statement against this or for this or saying something? Because we started seeing all kind of organizations and companies and corporations
Making
doing
statements.
things,
Yes.
saying things, making
Yes.
statements, having a voice, saying, this is where we stand on this issue. We stand with these people or with these people. We saw that. And I'm wondering, is there that kind of a position? Has the Seventh-day Adventist Church, have we taken a unilateral position on what's happening over there right now? And if we haven't, should our members be looking for or expecting some direction from the church? I know you said, you led into the last one by saying some of this should be personal, personal decisions or whatnot. But should the organization, should the church have a voice that is heard on things that are happening to this effect in places like Gaza, or even with the other conflict over in Ukraine? Where's the church stand on this stuff?
Yeah, and so I think
Is silence
um,
eloquence,
it's a
or is it?
so it's a very very tight rope. It's a very very tight rope in that the church is comprised of people who have diverse perspectives, and not just people in the pews, but people in administration, right? And so I'm sure there's um, a lot in administration, at least over here, who are probably siding with Israel because we know our administration is mostly conservative and mostly sort of fundamentalist, evangelical leaning, etc. And so, if any statement came out, I think it would sort of be no different than what we're hearing from Franklin Graham and others. I think it'd be a very similar
Mm,
statement. And so,
Hmm.
I personally, when I look at the prophetic voice, yes, I do think that there are times when the church needs to speak, and like most definitely, when it comes to George Floyd and etc., the church I think did need to say something, and thank God for North American Division that did raise its voice in that instance. In this instance, I think the church needs to call for peace, and so that's where it would be. I don't think the
mm,
church would be wise to get into the weeds all the way simply because the church is an organization. But I think the prophetic voices within the church would be the ones who can speak more with authenticity.
mm,
And so because we are not Catholics, we can't have someone speak, the GC president speak ex cathedra. This is how I feel, etc. And so,
sure.
whatever statement comes from General Conference is not going to be representative because we are more of like a Presbyterian type of organization. And so now, if we had a synod or something, another GC session or something, and then we had people vote, this is what we want, and the majority, and they said, okay, this is what came out to vote, fine, like that. But I would be very, very perturbed if, even if it was my position, the statement were made
Mm,
without the input of many, because we are not an episcopal system. So it's not about what the bishops think. It really is about what the people think. And so I think from a charismatic prophetic perspective, then we need to, on our pulpits and our areas of influence, how we feel the Spirit is leading us. I did want to say this. I did want to say this because I noticed that Rodney Smith was raising a lot of questions about the Mahdi and other things, and so Rodney, I do strongly recommend that you look at an article I wrote some years ago in Message magazine called "Jerusalem: A Prophetic Challenge,"
mm,
and this is just when Trump announced he was going to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and I look at it through the lens of prophecy, where I see how that relates to not only fundamentalist Christian prophecy, but Jewish prophecy and Islamic prophecy. And so that will
Hmm.
kind of, so that's the Message magazine article. You can find it online, Jerusalem: A Prophetic Challenge. And it's good to see my brother, Dr. Leslie Pollard. Good to see you, Les, for your support here. Mhm.
Yeah, let's maybe take a swipe at his question.
Right.
He says,
Hmm.
Doc Burton, that was masterful. Could you comment on the role of dispensationalism in Christian Zionism.
Yeah.
Maybe want to define that.
Yeah, Dr. Paula, that's an excellent question, because Christian Zionism in many ways may seem sort of like oxymoronic, right?
Yes.
When we look at this whole notion of Christian Zionism, it bases Christian support for Zionism. But in that article I just mentioned, Jerusalem, a prophetic challenge, I look at this whole Christian Zionism. The Jews need to get it back when they see the rebuilding of the temple, etc. There's a reason why we have sort of this dispensationalist push to see restoration of Jerusalem, and part of that dispensationalist push has to do with the desire to see Jesus come. And so the Christian Zionism, this dispensationalism, is not because they love Jews, it's because they
Wow.
they want a bunch of Jews to get killed so Jesus can come,
Oh my.
Mercy.
And in the article that I wrote, I basically talk about what the dispensations are looking for and what the Muslims are looking for. And again, Rodney Smith, he spoke about
Mahdi.
the expectation of the Mahdi, but the Mahdi is expected to do the very same thing. So the only person, and of course, when Netanyahu, he knows what the Muslims believe, he knows what the Christians believe, but he's basically saying, okay, this is really about Zephaniah. It's not about. It's about, and so yeah, so it's a strange thing with this Christian Zionism, with Christians claiming they're friends of Jews, but the only reason why they're friends of Jews is because they want this huge battle of Armageddon, so the whole bunch of them can get killed, so Jesus can come.
That's an interesting comment there from the Beacon Network. Christian Zionism predates Jewish Zionism.
Mhm. That's an interesting concept. And now, of course, Christian Zionism, if you're looking at Christian Zionism through the lens of what we call British Israelism, I can understand what the person is talking about. Of course, British Israelism is the movement that sees, Berit Ish, the British people as being the real sons of the covenant, etc. And so that's definitely, we see that little lean in there. But when we use the word Zionism, however, we go back to the 1890s with Theodor Herzl. Okay, and that's when the Zionist movement started, who, by the way, was a secular Jew from Austria, who looked at the reality of how Jews had been treated in Europe over the years. 11th century getting kicked out of England by Edward the Confessor, 12th century getting kicked out of France by Philip the Fair, the pogroms, the Holocaust, the whole nine. And so we understand this whole thing about what some people call Jews being seen as a pariah people, always being set upon, sort of thing. And so the Zionist movement was basically saying we need our own homeland. And so when we talk about Christian Zionism from a Darbyist perspective, we're really talking about Christians supporting the need for this sort of halia, this repatriation to this area, the rebuilding of the temple, so there can be this huge battle of Armageddon and Jesus can come.
The Temple Mount and the red heifer and all of those things that our evangelical friends tend to have put a lot of emphasis on, and particularly when we talk, and it's I think Dr. Pollard is a great question in terms of, and I wish we had a little bit more time to unpack some of that, because I think when it rubber hits the road for most of us right now in an eschatological and prophetic sense, that's where I think Adventist theology and eschatology kind of has a intersection with some of these things that sometimes we miss from the surface. So when we're into the whole Daniel 9, when we are unpacking that prophetically, the way that we do, and the way that a Christian Zionist unpacks those chapters are tend to be worlds apart. And I think that most of us as Adventists have some sort of a idea or understanding there, but until we really connect those dots, it still just seems kind of nebulous and theoretical. So I wish maybe we ought to have some more time to work on some of those things to really bring this to the front door step of most of our listeners.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, probably about 30 years ago, T.A. McNeely preached a sermon, "Don't worry, be ready." This is when Mike was kind of, "Don't worry, be happy." And basically, he was taking a look at the way that sometimes we get fixated on the fulfillment of prophecies. And he was basically saying, okay, this may happen, this may not happen, but at the end of the day, we need to be ready to do the work of the kingdom. And so I would hope that even as we do our searches through the prophecies and try to see what fits, etc., that we'll understand that Jesus says in John chapter 13, 34 and 35, "By this shall all people know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." And that we look at the final judgment scene in Matthew chapter 25 and know who Jesus is coming back for, people who are clothing the naked and feeding the hungry, etc., and just doing that work. And yes, it's good to sort of have an idea about what's going on, but I would say our preoccupation for the most part should be on doing the work of the kingdom. And so that when Jesus Christ returns, we'll know whose side we are on.
All right.
Right.
Man, if you got some people, man, already reviewing your work, Doc. They're reviewing your work.
Yeah, Brother Rodney permitted. He did. And thanks for that meal back at our Pelk, Rodney. He bought me a beautiful meal, me and my family.
All right. Very good. All right. Well, listen, I think we had there's the music
Something.
going on.
I think is that our cue?
Yeah, we had a great conversation. Again, Dr. Burton, you have been on PRT, I think 3, maybe 4 times. I don't know, but we're always blessed when you come to share light on the subject that we are presenting to our audience. So thank you so much for coming on and our PRT podcast.
Yes, indeed, and we bask in the expertise and the knowledge, the wealth of knowledge that you have shared with us tonight, as you always do. We want to encourage our audience. Listen, you've heard some things tonight. Some things may have been familiar. Some things may have been very unfamiliar. When we have current events that point us to some questions that are asked, it's a good opportunity to dig deeper into the word, dig deeper into the prophecy, so that you can know, hey, is this thing, going back to one of our first questions, does this have a current import on the teachings of the Bible and where we stand in history now? Does it matter? Is it important? How do I interact or interface with my Jewish neighbor or my Palestinian coworker, et cetera, et cetera? How do I engage in conversations with people who have family members or close contacts who are being literally touched by these circumstances and these situations? We know that here on the PRT, we don't have the time to be able to go in all the way and give you everything, but we hope that what you do get out of these conversations is a little inspiration, a little motivation, a little information to be able to navigate in the world that you live in the neighborhood that you live in the workplace that you live in the classroom that you sit in a way that helps people to recognize that you, through the Holy Spirit, are being resourced, relevant, and real. Dion, you want to take Roger's spot tonight and take us out?
All right, let me, I got to fix my voice, man. I got to get that deep voice, Well, thank you so much. Listen, thank you so much for joining the Pastors Roundtable, where we aim to help you keep ministry relevant,
resourced,
and real. God bless.
Good night, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Please.